Any views or opinions expressed in this podcast are strictly the views or opinions of the presenter. Nothing in here is the view of the firms, corporations, financial entities that anybody represents. Nothing expressed here is a view of any regulator or semi-regulatory agency. All content is intended to be educational. Nothing in this episode construes specific investment advice, and if you do require advice, you should seek an appropriate advisor, be that a financial planner or a tax advisor or possibly a lawyer. And welcome back to the CE Drive podcast. I am really excited about this episode. I tried something a little bit different here. Still one interview with one person. But I brought on somebody with no exposure really to financial services, at least not specifically. So this episode, we're going to be submitting it for a bunch of CE credits, and we'll see how this works out. We're shooting for one life insurance credit in BC. We're shooting for one life and one A&S credit in Alberta. We're looking for a Saskatchewan ethics credit. We don't get that very often, and we'll see how that application goes. Manitoba life insurance credit, Ontario life insurance credit, an ethics credit with Advocacy or IAS, financial planning credit with FP Canada, compliance credit with IROC, and business conduct credit with MFDA. So hopefully we get all of those in. I'm going to roll into the interview momentarily here. I'll have a few closing comments afterwards. The object for today, this is my pocket knife / pocket tool. It'll show up in the quiz as a pocket tool, and it's my little folding Leatherman. And I've always had something like this. This is the, I think this is called the Leatherman Wingman. There we go. I actually got this for free at an Advocacy event a few years ago. So nice gift. That's a good giveaway. But anyways, I always carry something like that with me. I've done a lot of stuff with my Leatherman over the years, notably cut off the end of just the very, very tip of my thumb in France a couple of years ago. Yeah, always good to have something like that. I used to carry one as a matter of course, but now you have so many places you can't carry a pocket knife, such as an airport. So I have to really make a conscious thought to put that in my pocket. Okay, let's hear from Paul then. Super interesting interview, fascinating background, lots of great stories here. And like I said, I'll have a few comments afterwards. Hi, I'm here today with Paul Ribner. Paul is a former Calgary City police officer, and I met Paul recently at the Center to End All Sexual Exploitation 25th anniversary. Great to see you get the CEAS Man of the Year award there, Paul. Always I love to see that award get handed out because just shows people are doing great things. And of course, you got this because of your work, I think mostly post your police career with I'm Worth It Now is the organization you're representing here today. Can you chat a little bit about yourself and about IWIN or I'm Worth It Now?
Well, thanks very much. Yeah, that award was certainly unexpected, but certainly appreciated. Yeah, I actually started working with I'm Worth or IWIN before I retired. In fact, I'm one of the co-founders of that organization. And how it all came about, just as a bit of background, I was doing a series of presentations on sexual exploitation and trafficking in the Calgary area. And the other co-founder, Kristen, was actually at two of those presentations. And after the second presentation, she approached me and pitched this idea. A friend of hers was part of a similar program in Florida, and she asked me if I thought there would be any opportunity to start up a similar program in Calgary. I thought immediately, yeah, there was a need, because in addition to my work with the Calgary Police Service, one of my duties was working with outreach organizations whose sole function was to work with trafficked and exploited women. Much like CEAS in Edmonton, there was an organization here in Calgary that's very analogous to them. And so that was my thought, is that a program that Kristen was describing would work very well in helping support this program in Calgary, and that's really the genesis of IWIN. We started off on a very small scale, providing I think 12 backpacks initially for Reset, the Reset Society of Calgary, and this was in 2019. And in the intervening years, we've now grown to where we're supporting not only Reset in Calgary, but CEAS in Edmonton, and a program in Saskatoon as well. So it's growing quickly. We're trying to manage the growth so that we don't overextend ourselves, because that's a real risk, because there is a definite need for this sort of program, and we want to make sure that whatever growth we do is thoughtful and meaningful, so that we can continue with the level of support that we currently enjoy.
And as I understand it, sort of at IWIN, you would put together a backpack of essential supplies. You got somebody who's leaving a vulnerable situation or in a vulnerable situation, maybe still. They have this need for, I assume, toiletries and change of clothes. What other kind of stuff would you have in there, Paul? What happens?
Yeah, so what happens is we don't deal with individuals ourselves at IWIN. What we do is we work directly with those three organizations, Reset, CEAS, and Hope Restored in Saskatoon. So these are organizations that when a woman comes to their program with the intent of exiting an exploitive lifestyle, often they only show up with the clothes on their back. Maybe they've lived in those clothes for 2, 3, 4 days a week, perhaps. So what's in the backpack is some very thoughtful and intentional articles, and I'll speak to that in a minute. But yes, it's a change of clothes. So like, yoga pants. There's a t-shirt, a hoodie, clean underwear, socks, all the toiletries, shampoo, conditioner, hairbrush, toothbrush, all those sorts of things, floss, lotions, and they're all. One of the important things that we were very cognizant of initially was that all of the products that we wanted to include in these backpacks had the potential to be triggering for the women that were receiving them. And by that, I mean, a lot of organizations would sometimes just, trying to do some street outreach, and they would hand out, smaller parcels of items on the street, perhaps, and it would be a hotel-sized shampoo, travel-sized articles. And it triggers the women because those are found in hotels where typically they're either trafficked or exploited. So we were very intentional in that, is that, none of the labeling on any of the products hopefully are at risk of triggering. All the lotions and shampoos and all those things are full size, nothing to sort of trigger any memories of negative experiences that they may have encountered.
I would have never thought of that. And in fact, I've been, guilty of that myself. I know, my wife and I have made a habit of gathering like the hotel sample sizes, and CEAS has a little bin at the front when you go in there, and I'm always filling that bin. So, that's a good, just a thing to be aware of that I never would have thought about myself.
What, and you're like most of the general population, and you didn't think of that because you haven't worked, thankfully, probably, with this population. And that's a piece of information that I had, because for better or worse, for 11 years, that was the last 11 years of my career with the CPS, was working with trafficked and exploited women, and it's something that I probably wouldn't have thought of before I started this work as well. So it's just something that little things like that without that experience, people have no reason to think about.
Yeah, certainly when I see the CEAS participants, they're well after any of that stuff would be so prevalent. But yeah, absolutely. Now, you mentioned, so you worked about the last, I think, third or so, maybe half your career with Vice. And this is maybe not a financial question directly, but I think it's interesting, obviously. What do you think our listeners would find most interesting or surprising, maybe, about, you just gave a good example about folks leaving the sex trade?
Uh, what most people that I spoke with when I was doing my education pieces probably found more interesting or surprising, I guess, was that about 98% of the women I dealt with were Canadian citizens. Um, Virtually every woman, every sex trafficked woman, and I only dealt with sex trafficking. I didn't do any labor trafficking investigations at all, but every sex trafficking, almost every sex trafficking survivor that I worked with was born and raised in Canada. And a lot of people have these misconceptions that it happens to somebody else, that it's, usually people coming in, being moved in from another country. And that certainly does happen, don't get me wrong. But in Calgary, in Alberta, that's typically not what we see. And the stats that we see in Calgary are very similar to what's being seen in Edmonton and other parts of the province, in that the women that are being trafficked are born and raised here. They're our mothers, our sisters, our aunts. And that usually takes most people by surprise.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And, again, just from my experience, you see, like I get to deal with the cease participants mostly, well after. And yeah, they do seem, no different than anybody
Yeah.
else that I might run into in my day-to-day life, and, other than whatever's happened in their history, right? So,
Well, and that's a good point, because and it's interesting the words that you chose, that they seem like everybody else, because they are. You often hear people say, well, geez, he didn't look like a pimp, or he didn't look like a bank robber. Well, I challenge anybody to tell me what a pimp or a bank robber actually looks like, because they could be anybody. And it's the same thing with our survivors, right? They come from all walks of life. Another misconception is that, it's the women that we encounter and work with are sort of from, sort of the other side of the tracks. And nothing could be further from the truth, because vulnerability is not linked to socioeconomic status. You can be a little bit more vulnerable if you are economically disadvantaged. But I've worked with women, with university degrees, gainfully employed in their chosen field. I've worked with women whose, fathers are lawyers and mothers are master's degree social workers. And I've worked with women who come from, single parent homes where addiction was an issue as well. And everybody on that spectrum, right? So there is sort of no typical survivor, just like there's no typical offender.
yeah, that's a good point. I want to come back to that typical offender thing a little bit later on here. And we just had, it's now about a month ago or so, probably be 2 months by the time this goes live. We just had this fairly high profile story in Edmonton of this 13-year-old girl who was thankfully found in Portland, having been trafficked across the border. You just talked about sort of in Canada, staying in Canada. How typical is that kind of thing? Is this story something we should be surprised at?
In my experience, it's rare. I have investigated cases or at least one case in Calgary, where an offender came to Calgary from California under similar circumstances, but committed his offenses in Canada versus transporting the youth in that case back across the border. So yeah, to your point, that circumstance, I think, is the exception rather than the rule when we're talking about exploited youth, and even exploited adults for the most part. At least, again, most of my experience is in Calgary, certainly Alberta, but I do have I do have or have had connections with jurisdictions across the country, so I'm basing some of that on some of those cross provincial or interprovincial files as well.
Perfect. Now we're going to move on to the financial stuff here. And I want to just give the caveat, you are in no way a representative of FinTrack. You're not you were an on the ground police officer.
That's right.
And I'm wondering though about what you saw in terms of dealing with FinTrack or how you interacted with them. Is there anything you can tell us to give us a little background here?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I dealt with FinTrack tangentially. I heard about it very early on in my career in Vice, and occasionally we would get presentations from different groups about the abilities of FinTrack. I was on the receiving end of regular information packets from FinTrack, and I was astonished at the amount of information that was actually contained in all the banking information and things like that. all sort of encapsulated in one neat little package, individual by individual.
So if I'm suspected of having done something untoward and FINTRAC gets involved, you're going to see all of my bank and credit card transactions going back for years and years. Like, is that level of detail?
Well, from what I could see, and again, I'm not a financial expert at all, and honestly, some of the information that was contained meant nothing to me because I've never been really formally trained in financial investigations. But what I could see, and as I understand it, and you probably have maybe more information on this whole process, but if a banking institution flags a customer's account based on certain parameters, they check a certain number of boxes, and that raises the proper flags, they will then collect that account information and send it off perhaps to the law enforcement of jurisdiction. And that's what I would get. So it would be information on an individual. And from what I could tell and what I could remember, and forgive me, it's probably been several years since I've looked at a FINTRAC report. It was banking information over a finite period of time. And the FINTRAC investigator that compiled all this and forwarded it on to me would highlight the transactions of, sorry, I just have to.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So the FINTRAC investigator sort of highlighted the transactions of concern, and then as an investigator, then it would have been up to me to use that information in conjunction with an investigation that I might have been working on. So for example, if I had a survivor who said that she was working in Calgary and Lac La Biche and Fort McMurray on certain dates, and on each of those dates she deposited X amount of dollars into a bank account that wasn't hers, but it might have been her pimp's. Now, if FINTRAC could find that bank account and match up those deposits that corroborate what the survivor tells me, then I would be able to use that as part of the prosecution to support the charge. So that's where the FINTRAC information becomes very, very useful. The problem is in certainly a sex trafficking or an exploitation file, we don't get to court unless the survivor wants to participate in a criminal proceeding. And that is generally the biggest hurdle that I, as an investigator, had to overcome. I mean, we could talk about corroboration and things of that afterwards, but the biggest hurdle was, first of all, getting the survivor to have some faith in the justice system, have some faith in law enforcement, and willingly undergo a process that was going to force her to recount her story at least 3 times before we get this resolved.
Yeah, I want to circle back just to a quick comment you made there. You'd say, and I've heard this before, I think this is something that shows up in, I don't know if you're aware of, is it Tamia's project? I can't remember.
Yeah, Tamia Nagy, yeah.
Tamia Nagy,
a friend of mine.
Okay, so she talks about this where, that idea of depositing money into somebody else's account, is that done using a debit card, or is that like at an ATM, or is that done in person at the bank?
In my experience, based on surveillance that I did during many of our investigations, it's generally done at ATM, which helps us with corroboration, because then we can get records from the ATM because there's cameras, etc. Yeah. So and that's where we, like I said, we often didn't struggle with corroborating a lot of these stories. The biggest struggle was just getting the distrust of the justice system overcome.
Right, and again, reliving that trauma and all that goes along. I
always describe it to the women. I always describe it to the women as picking off the scabs.
Yeah,
and it would heal afterwards, right? But it's going to be painful during the process.
Yeah, I could see that. Like I don't know what I would do in that situation, whether I'd be willing to go back or whether you just want to move on, right, and be done with it. And
exactly, and for not only that reason, I feel like I've grown a lot in being able to work with a lot of those survivors, because I've learned a lot from them. Not the least of which is resilience, because what some of them have gone through, and the mere fact that they're still here in front of us is astonishing. So it was always getting a prosecution was usually fairly low on my list of priorities. Making sure that the survivor was healthy and on the road to recovery was always at the top of the list.
So this idea of getting a prosecution here. So, I talked about getting evidence and corroborating and so forth. Just offline before we started recording here, we were chatting a little bit about the overall difficulty in Canada of prosecuting financial crimes. Can you talk a little bit about where there's maybe some gaps here, or why this doesn't happen as much as maybe folks might like to see?
Well, my personal opinion, and again, I'm no expert, I think there's a couple of issues at play. First of all, most police agencies are strapped for manpower, so they don't have a lot of people to devote to financial investigations, which, from what I understand, are extremely complex and time consuming. Secondly, I'm not sure that there's a great deal of training available such that it would be available to a wider audience within a police service, because it is such a specialized area of investigation. So I don't think even getting it out on a widespread scale to street level constables probably wouldn't be very effective, just because they wouldn't have the time to follow up, or the in-depth knowledge that a subject matter expert really would have to have in order to unravel all those layers, right? And beyond that, or I guess in addition to that, and again, just my feeling is that there's probably not a great deal of experience within the Crown Prosecution Service in terms of prosecuting financial crimes, just because of their complexity. I don't know how much case law there is. I'm sure that there's been some very large, in terms of monetary value, prosecutions that have taken place in Canada. And I think that's part of the other thing, is that because of the sheer volume of potential investigations and the limited manpower that most agencies, whether it's police agencies or prosecution agencies have, they're limiting themselves to the larger value crimes. So unless you're talking maybe $500,000 and up, they're probably not going to have the inclination to look at it, just because of the cost benefit analysis, I guess, in mounting a prosecution.
Yeah, and it's tough because we're looking at what's happening with Fortress, with the mortgage situation in Ontario right now, where it looks like there was some untoward stuff done, a lot of it probably, and the number of people that seem likely to get prosecuted out of this seems very low compared to the number of people who probably knew something was not being done above board. So, and that's a high profile one. Like, that's not,
right.
Yeah. So yeah, I agree with you. I think that those are two really good explanations. My third here is going to be that anybody who's serious about this kind of thing, they have a lawyer like before they start doing this stuff, right? So you're already kind of preparing yourself for a complex case.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's it. And so when you think about, like, in Edmonton here, I used to deal with the economic crimes unit of the EPS, and they talked about $5,000 and $10,000, check cashing schemes and, blank credit card schemes and that kind of thing. And you're like, well, does anybody ever end up actually in real trouble because of that? And it sounds like probably not all that often.
Not that I'm aware of. In my limited experience working with the economic crimes here, like I said, it was, unless there was a lot of zeros involved, typically they didn't have the bandwidth to take on that investigation.
Yeah, that's tough. Now, just going back to FinTrack getting involved here, and you said, I know not an expert on the FinTrack rules, but do you ever have a sense of what actually, like, was it a teller at the bank? Was it automated processes? Was it an astute manager? Do you ever have a sense of what triggered FinTrack to get involved?
I have a sense that it was automated processes that cash deposits over a short period of time at multiple locations, and not just multiple locations within a city or a town, but let's say there's been 12 cash deposits in 4 cities within 10 days, that sort of thing.
That makes perfect sense with what you're talking about before with the person depositing money in Edmonton, Calgary, and Lac-La-Biche. That's
right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is what I always wonder about. We make from our side, especially in the banking world, you make this big deal out of $10,000 and suspicious transactions and so forth. And I always wonder how much of it actually gets flagged, how often somebody sees something. I don't think I've ever had a student, I've dealt with 5,000 or 6,000 students over the years, and I don't think I've ever had a student tell me that they actually flagged something for FinTrack. So,
well, and I think that's partially because most people, even somebody as financially ignorant as I am, know about that $10,000 threshold, right? But nobody thinks that banks are tracking your transaction activity in many other ways, and it's one of those methods that help us, because they can track those, like I said, those multiple deposits from multiple locations over a short period of time that raises a couple of flags, and then gets a FinTrack investigator looking a bit further into it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example of where FinTrack shows up in a fairly concrete way. And I, again, not recognizing that that's not your area of expertise, but I think that's really helpful, Paul. I think a lot of my listeners would sort of see FinTrack as an annoyance, and here's a good example of them, doing good work.
Oh, and yeah, they're doing good work, and that was the thing, because I would get often. There were some weeks where I was getting 2 FinTrack reports a week, and then I wouldn't get any for a while, and then I might end up with 4 the next month type thing. And it's not because I requested them; it was because somebody was flagging these events in our jurisdiction, and it had some of the earmarks that they've been educated on in terms of potential trafficking activity.
Now, you said you sort of alluded to requesting FinTrack reports, so it was possible for you to reach back into FinTrack and say, hey, can you have a look at this person?
I did have that ability. I did, in my old life, have a contact that I could, a law enforcement contact within FinTrack that I could contact if we had a prosecution where there was, we needed that sort of corroboration where we could find some of those transaction records and things like that, rather than going through, as I recall now, again, I'm going back several years, I think it was easier to go through FinTrack than it was to go through the banking institution themselves.
Right. That would make sense. And again, they'd have the right levers to pull and all that goes along with that. So, yeah. Okay, that's perfect. Now, this might be a little bit of a stretch again. We're going back several years here, but can you think of cases where, in retrospect, you're dealing with aftermath with the survivor, or even possibly actually prosecuting, and you look at this and you say, wow, somebody should have picked something up here, like FinTrack should have been involved. The financial institution failed, or do you recall that thought at all?
No, not with regard to FinTrack or banking institutions. I did have some what I considered to be failures from other systems where we would do search warrants on locations and find tens of thousands of dollars in cash unexplained, and we would forward cases like that. And I'm truncating some of the evidence that we have, but there was ample evidence of income tax fraud, income tax evasion.
Oh,
People
interesting.
living in $800,000 homes and claiming $50,000 of income, but we're finding tens of thousands of dollars of cash in the search warrant based on the work that they were doing. Now, again, this was prior to some changes with the prostitution laws in 2014, the Bedford decision. But we would forward those cases off to CRA and economic crimes and of jurisdictions, because sometimes they weren't always Alberta residents. And as far as I know, none of those cases were prosecuted, at least by CRA or any of the other organizations. So yeah, there was some frustration there because these people. I mean, we have to give the money back because we couldn't prove.
Right.
Well, we could, but again, there was an issue with the judiciary and things like that. But yeah, so there was some frustrations. But to your question, I don't recall anything where I could say, in my opinion at the time, that the bank dropped the ball, or I wish FinTrack would have been a little bit more heads up. No.
Yeah, it's interesting, the CRA thing, because they have recently, just in the last, I want to say 36 months or so, at CRA started doing postal code audits,
Right.
where they will look at, if you're a 45-year-old living in a neighborhood where the houses are all $900,000 houses, and you're showing $50,000 of taxable income, and everybody else on your block is showing 150, that's an audit trigger now.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, that's new. That's not that's something that really they need a little bit of big data to be able to pull off. So
right, and appreciate too that, I mean, we were doing those warrants in back in the early 2010s, and then when that Supreme Court decision came down in 2014, those investigations, or at least that method of investigation, came to a screeching halt. So we weren't doing the search warrants anymore and finding all the cash. Although I'm sure they still exist, they're technically not in violation of those now rescinded portions of the charter.
interesting. Okay, I'm not aware of that. I'll read the Bedford decision and post a link to it. So that's far outside of my expertise. Sounds like a bit of a pain, though.
It was a challenge for police agencies or police officers in my area, in Vice across the country. We had to change the way we did business. It didn't affect us in Calgary too much, other than the fact that we couldn't do those investigations that led us to the cash, so that the people that were keeping the body houses. But essentially, what the Supreme Court said was that there were three provisions of the prostitution laws as they existed at the time that were overbroad and overreaching and infringe on charter rights. So the government of Canada rescinded those three. They were given 12 months to rewrite the law, and they did it in 6. And that's the regime under which we're operating now.
Okay, when you say that, I'm aware of that much more broadly, but
that's the Reader's Digest version.
Perfect. That's a good summary, Paul. Thank you so much. Now, I just want to talk about suspicious transactions here. Some of the things that I've seen in my time at CEAS, because, like I said before, I get to see the folks at CEAS a few months typically after they've emerged from, whatever they were dealing with at the worst moments. So I'm curious if you've seen this or if these are regular patterns. But one here, student loan fraud. So the one that I can think of, a particular person at CEAS that I dealt with, where her trafficker had her take out a student loan, $17,500, if I remember right, is your max in Alberta in one semester. She enrolled in a post-secondary institution, paid her tuition, dropped out within the first week when there was still a 50% refund of tuition available, gets the cash back, hands it over to her trafficker. And subsequently, the trafficker, she has the debt, trafficker has the cash, right?
Yeah.
Have you seen that kind of thing?
Yeah, student loans like that, mortgages, car loans, bank loans. Yeah, it's very, very common. And there's actually an organization, I'm not sure if you're aware of them, that has started fairly recently. And when I say fairly recently, the last 4 or 5 years, in Ontario, but they're working with survivors across the country, Project Recover. Yeah. Richard Dunwoody is the one that started that program. And their sole purpose is to get the lending organizations, and so far, and I don't want to jinx him here, but so far he's batting 1,000, has not lost in a case, to get the lending institution, whether it's a bank or an educational institution, to forgive that loan if it was obtained while a woman was being trafficked or exploited.
Yeah, and I am aware. I've actually spoken to Richard as well. I'm aware of Project Recover. That is a fantastic initiative and so
it really
badly
is
needed. Yeah, I wish that I had known about them. Well, probably about the time that probably coincides with right about when I first read into that exact thing. So that's it's super valuable work though, and I find it's often just awareness, right? It's often like I don't think that people at financial institutions want to think that that's how they're making their money. Right. Once somebody's aware.
Sure. I mean, and that's one of the things about this whole topic, the topic of exploitation and trafficking in general. It's an uncomfortable conversation. Nobody wants to talk about this, but unless we do, it's gonna continue, right? And that's one of the things that I always try to impart upon people, is that we often talk about the women that are involved, and the survivors, but we're tend to often miss the other half of the equation, because without the men trafficking them or exploiting them, the problem wouldn't exist either. So we have to have the conversations, not just amongst ourselves, but with our brothers and uncles and fathers and those people as well. But yeah, it's not a dinner table conversation that most people are willing to have. I mean, and for good reason, but it's something that still needs to be talked about.
Yeah. Now, that being said, I've gotten more myself, just given my work at CEAS, I've gotten more comfortable talking about it. And you're right. Sometimes it's not good dinner table conversation, but I have had that dinner table conversation. And
well, and it's about your audience too, right? I mean, there were a lot of those conversations at the CEAS event, right? But if you go to your niece's high school graduation, you're probably not going to have the same conversation.
That's a fair point.
It's all about knowing your audience.
Yes, 100%. So my next one, this one is tough. This is the one that I don't know how to solve this problem, and I don't. It's hard to say. There's always two sides to every story, but at least the story I was told by the survivor here was that she's in a police car which has been stolen, with her trafficker driving the police car, and there's like a romantic relationship or whatever, or like she calls him her boyfriend, but it's not really what it is, right? And he does a ton of damage with this police car, hundreds of thousands of dollars of damage, crashes the car. They're sitting there, the car's crashed. He says, like, if I get arrested for this, I'm going back to jail for a very long time. And she switches seats with him, and it's her sort of first serious offense, so she gets a brief stint in jail, but she ends up with, and this is in the Saskatchewan court system, she ends up with a $200,000 court fine. And you can't get rid of a court fine via bankruptcy or consumer proposal. I don't know if Project Recover, like this is the one where I think, how is this ever going to get dealt with?
That's a tough one. And I've worked with a number of women who have taken the heat for their, boyfriends, under similar circumstances. It might be a dope charge. It might be a gun charge. In this case, a massive property damage charge. And I don't know anybody that's been able to get out from underneath those charges post-conviction.
Yeah, I don't know what you do.
You know what? The courts are full of case laws for the first time, right? So there has to be a first for all these cases. And, for a good criminal lawyer, that might be a good challenge for them. As I said, most of the women that I've worked with that have taken charges, we've been able to negotiate with the Crown ahead of time based on their circumstance, and talk about the psychological restraint that he had over her, the power imbalance, all those sorts of things that led her to falsely take responsibility for his actions. But those are all pre-conviction. So post-conviction, I don't think it's impossible. I think you just need a really good lawyer willing to fight the fight.
That's a good point. So if anybody out there knows a good criminal defense lawyer in Alberta, get them to reach out to me. That's
that wants to take it on pro bono, probably.
yeah. In this case, that's what I mean by good. So yeah, um, yeah. And then the last one, you already touched on this. I see this a lot. The utility bills, right, where the survivor has the Shaw account and the EPCOR account and just everything in their name, and really the trafficker is going to run 3 or 4 months for free essentially because they have no intention of paying those bills.
Yeah, and again, I think Project Recover can help with some of that. I know some police services can help with that. I've written letters myself for women to utility providers and cell phone companies and things of that nature, explaining the situation. As long as there's a police case number that can be referenced that shows it's legitimate and not just somebody, printing it off of their Mac and handing it in, sort of thing. I think there's options there as well with the utility providers, as opposed to banks and other financial institutions, who typically have larger losses to deal with.
Yeah, I agree with that. I've had the same success there where you sit down with that person, you help them craft a letter, send it off to the utility provider's legal counsel or whatever. And it does usually work, although it can take some effort, right?
Yeah. And effort's a good thing to touch on as well too, because, it's important that when we're working with survivors that we get them to put in the effort as well, and not just rely on you or me or whoever it is that is working with them to do all the heavy lifting. I always said that, I'll work with you to do whatever you want or need me to do if I can, but I'm not going to work harder than you. Right.
Yeah. It's a good point. And I always think too, and especially where I'm dealing where it's, after the fact, there's a Maslow's pyramid problem, right?
Yeah.
Where a lot of times you're dealing with addictions issues, or you're, still emerging from the prison system or whatever it is. My stupid financial stuff is like way, way, way detached from your immediate concerns.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And I often refer to Maslow in my presentations, and it perfectly ties back into what we talked about at the very start about vulnerabilities and not being a socioeconomic matter. What it is, it's the basic human needs, Maslow's basic human needs: shelter, food, security, sense of family, those things. And if any of those are missing, whether you make minimum wage or whether or not you got $100,000 in the bank, if any of those basic needs are missing, you're going to be vulnerable to be taken advantage of. And if you've got multiple basic needs missing, you're exponentially more vulnerable.
It's a great point. Yeah, that opens that door, right?
Yeah.
Now you touched on this already, and you sort of said you feel like probably the majority of the FinTrack stuff you saw came from some sort of big data efforts. Do you think we should be optimistic here? Do you think this is going to make it harder to be a human trafficker? Do you think the criminals are getting smarter? What's the prognosis here?
Well, like I said, I think the information that FinTrack provides is really helpful to an investigation if the prosecution is going to go ahead. And that again is the biggest challenge. What FinTrack already provides, I think, is more than enough to satisfy what we would need to prove in a criminal prosecution. But the challenge is to get the survivor into court where we can introduce that evidence. It's much as I felt frustration in coming up with good evidence and forwarding off to CRA and having nothing done with it, I can only imagine that some of the FinTrack investigators feel the same way, because they put all these really good packages together that details all the transactions and stuff that connect the dots and all those things, and then nothing happens with it. So I can empathize with them, but again, there are certain elements of that whole prosecutorial chain that none of us are in control of, and that's whether or not the survivor wants to put herself out there and go and tell her story in front of, judge and jury and whoever else may be in the courtroom.
So almost everybody listening to this or watching this will be subject to some rule from FINTRAC. There's a set of guidelines for financial advisors, for insurance agents, for financial planners, for wealth managers. We all have some rule. There's going to be hardly anybody listening who isn't going to have to report suspicious transactions, doesn't have an obligation to have at least a money laundering or an anti-money laundering policy. Do you think those things make a difference? Like, is that actually helping to keep some of this activity at bay? Do you think that's some lip service? Do you have an opinion around that, Paul, that would be helpful here?
My opinion is, yeah, it's helpful. Is it going to be helpful in every single instance? Probably not. But if it's helpful in one case, if it helps put one trafficker in prison, then I think then it's worth all the work. I don't think that the traffickers are sophisticated enough, at least at this point, to start being a little more cautious in terms of what they do with their money and how they move it from point A to point B. So I don't think there's any immediate risk of them outsmarting the system as it currently exists. So I think the work can and should continue. And like I said, if it helps in a successful prosecution in one time, that's going to lead to a second time. It's going to lead to a third time. And I think then once this type of evidence gets some traction, I think that ball will continue to gather momentum.
Yeah, my thought process around this is always that, there are people out there with this kind of money. Like you talked before about people with, multi-$100,000 homes or, maybe low 7-figure homes sitting on cash. And, you don't, like, that whole thing means that there is money moving through channels somewhere along the way. Yeah. And to me, being responsible about your anti-money laundering obligations, it just keeps, it's one level of access that's cut off, right? It's a place
right.
that we,
yeah.
Yeah, I think that it would be unusual today for somebody to try and bring their money to a financial advisor for, money laundering in this scale. Although I haven't seen the show myself, but I know Ozark is all about that.
Oh, yeah. You should see the show.
Yeah, I did watch the first episode and I couldn't quite get into it. So yeah, I've heard that though. I've heard I should watch the rest.
Yeah.
Maybe I will. But it's still, I think I would be shocked, honestly. And I think not because I'm naive. I think I would be just shocked if one of my students came to me and said, Jason, I had this person come to me and it was pretty obvious there was something untoward going on. I called FINTRAC. Right.
Right. Yeah. And I think the likelihood of a individual sort of spotting something like that is probably fairly low. Probably by the very nature of the fact that not many people actually physically go into the bank anymore. It's all done electronically, right? And that's where some of the programs that work behind the scenes that FINTRAC has, I think, that tend to flag activity on multiple levels is probably going to be the way that we identify a lot of these transactions, rather than a teller or a manager being really switched on.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks. Yeah. And then any last comments about those FINTRAC or AML obligations? Anything that we didn't touch on there, Paul?
I don't think so. We did talk about, the lack of resources for Crown prosecutors, for police officers, for other investigators, whether they're, provincial investigators or banking investigators and things like that. I think the only way that we're going to start making an impact, like any area, whether it's homicides or whether it's sex crimes or whether it's vice or, auto theft, is to dedicate some resources to creating and cultivating subject matter experts in the investigators. Because without the investigators, you're not going to get it to the Crown, and without the Crown, you're not going to get it to the courts. right? So on the one hand, there's just a break in the chain. We've got some really good financial investigators in FinTrack and in the banking systems, limited resources and limited expertise at the police, maybe better resources, but and knowledge at the Crown. And then, the courts, I don't know what they're like at all, but I think there's a gap there in education and training. And it's not probably because of lack of effort. It's probably a lack of human resources, because everybody's stretched thin. The Calgary Police Service is under their authorized strength because we got more people retiring than they're hiring right now. And that's just, you can't just knit an investigator. It's going to take some time. So until we can start closing that gap and increasing some education and training, so you can create some people that have at an investigative level a really good grasp of financial crime, then I think we're going to struggle.
Yeah, that's a good message, I think. Paul, now can we circle back? You were good enough to give us a little bit of a rundown of iWin before, but I think I've got a few iWin questions that I'd still like to wrap up on here. So when you get this backpack, and I think you're not always there necessarily to see the folks get their backpack, do you think of it mostly, is that like financial support? Is it emotional support? How do you think people perceive that?
Well, it's financial support for the organization. The contents of the backpacks, I mean, we work very hard to try to source our backpacks and get our costs down, but the backpacks cost about $100 a piece by the time we get them assembled. In 2021, we delivered 50 of those to Reset, for example. That's $5,000 off of a nonprofit's balance sheet that they can allocate elsewhere in the program. So that's good. But for the women that receive it, it's emotional and psychological more than anything, and emotional probably above that. Just talking to the women, because I worked very closely with Reset for a while, but if I would take my Reset hat off and put my iWin hat on and speak with them and just talking about what it meant to them to get that, it would bring tears to your eyes. Just the impact that a total stranger, because not only are there goods and stuff inside the backpack, each one comes with a handwritten note, anonymous, and a bracelet that not only the survivor can wear, but there's a matching one out there by the person that stuffed the backpack. So not only do they get some things when they really need them with no strings attached, no charge, no fee, nothing asked from them, but they also get this handwritten note that tells them that somebody out there, a total stranger, is thinking about them and has done this for them for no other reason than they just want them to have some nice stuff.
That's really great. I didn't know about the handwritten note. That's a nice touch, and I'm sure
that's our secret weapon.
It adds to the impact in a lot of ways, I'm sure.
Yeah. So. Oh, absolutely it does. Yeah. We've got testimonials, and it's actually, I think some of the testimonials might be on the iWin website, about the impact of receiving the backpack has had.
Yeah, I did see some YouTube videos, so I'll find something there and throw it into the show notes. That's great. And then, so sorry, I'm not. You're a nonprofit. You're not charity, are you, Paul? Do I have that right?
No, we're a registered charity now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, nice. Okay.
It took a while
Yes,
to get
status,
but yeah, we are a registered charity.
So if somebody wants to donate, you do this through Canada Helps, or how do you
through
donations?
I think through all of our social media, there's information on how to do it. So we get a Facebook page, Instagram, Twitter. I'm not all up on social media. I don't do that part. I'm the co-founder and the distribution guy. So we got other folks that are way better versed in all the social media stuff. But I know we do have a Facebook page, Twitter, Instagram, so they can find it, and all the information on how to donate, how to help out. In fact, what we've done, because as I said earlier, we're very cautious and intentional about the things that we purchase and put in the backpacks. I think we created a link to Amazon for specific items. So people can just buy those, get the Amazon link, and they can be confident then that that item will make it to a backpack, because we've had many items donated that simply weren't suitable. We've had to donate them elsewhere.
Right. Yeah, I do agree with this. I from my background in nonprofit, it's always better to get cash, but
yeah, cash is king.
Yes, cash is king. Okay, well, that's amazing, Paul. I'd like to thank you very much for the work you're doing with iWin and all that you did in your years on the police force. Both, a great sort of follow on to great career that way. Do you have any parting words for us? Final thoughts or words of advice?
No, I think I've exhausted what I hope to say on here. I do appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. As you mentioned, I spent a good third of my policing career working with this population. It's a population I'm still very passionate about and care very deeply for. So any opportunity I can take to bring some awareness, I will absolutely take that opportunity. And again, I thank you for this opportunity. And it's been my absolute pleasure. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks. You've been a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. Thanks so much, and have a great day, Paul.
Okay, bye now.
Okay, so I like this because it shows the impact. I think you hear this in the interview, shows the impact of really paying attention on the anti-money laundering side. And I know Paul talks in here primarily about big data. I do make the point in the interview, and I think it's a valid point, that one of the things that we are confident of when we're working with insurance agents and financial planners and securities folks is that we have effective AML policies. So the understanding here is that everybody listening to this episode has AML policies in place, and it really removes a significant avenue. And you hear Paul talk in the interview about real estate, for example, as a potential avenue for money laundering. And the real estate sector notably has been a little bit, let's say, slower to adopt some AML policies. It hasn't been that long since you could buy a house with a bag full of cash and nobody would notify FinTrack about it. So you have some other sectors where this is less certain. So I know you say, well, nobody's ever going to come and try and launder, their sex trafficking proceeds with me. But that's because they are aware that this is not really an available avenue. So I would say you continue to have an obligation here to have good AML policies in place and really to pay attention still for suspicious transactions. There's plenty of reasons to pay attention for suspicious transactions, such as elder abuse or undue influence, even if we're not thinking specifically about the kind of stuff Paul talks about in this episode. That being said, I hope that what he goes over here does issue a helpful reminder that there are good reasons to have AML policies in place and good reasons for FinTrack to do the work that it does. Okay, the number for today's episode is 6. The number for today's episode is 6. I hope you'll join me again in 2 weeks. We're going to get back to a more traditional type of interview with a financial advisor with Ian, who's been on the show before. But Ian actually brings an estate lawyer with him. This is kind of an interesting conversation about referrals and about delineating our own competencies and knowing when we're going to pass something over to the other professionals on the team. Really good discussion here, a lot of discussion about information sharing. So I think I might have been a little quick with the number here. Let's try that again. The number for today's episode is 6. Again, the number for today's episode is 6. I hope you'll join us again in 2 weeks for our discussion with Ian. And thanks so much for listening. Enjoy your continued studies.